Hello Cherries fans, and welcome back to another Sparky Stats video. But today I'm not claiming to be the expert whatsoever. It's going to be a fun little discussion about stats from the lesser talked about teams in the Premier League. There's the big six and they get all the headlines, maybe the big seven soon with Newcastle. But for now, we do have Alan from the other 14 on to talk to us a bit more about these stats that he and the rest of his team compile on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. Thank you so much for joining me today, Alan.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So, yeah, hopefully should be good fun to those of us that do like our stats. How did you originally come up with the idea for the other 14?
Yeah, so it's about 4 or 5 years ago. Actually, this is our 5th season doing this, but yeah, that's about 5 years ago. There was 3 of us together, and the initial idea was around the fact that we all supported 3 teams who are in the sort of nether regions of the Premier League at the time, and we were looking at the initial idea we had was this thing which is the baseline tracker table, which is the thing we always have pinned on the page, and it was really thinking about if you're in the nether regions of the Premier League, you're looking to get into the upper 30s, maybe 40 points, and that's the key target. We thought the way to get to that, some fixtures are easier than others, so we just thought of this tracker which would track the home games against the other teams who aren't in the big six, and that gives you 39 points. There's 13 other teams of the other 14, and that gets you to 39 points. So, and if you track each of the teams in that way, then you find the sort of lead and where you are relative to the bottom 3, and whatever changes might be different to what the real table was telling you. So that was our initial idea, and we were just doing that amongst ourselves in the pub, if you like, to start with. And then somebody else came in and said, well, this sounds really interesting and maybe useful. You should maybe make it a bit more public. So hence we started the Twitter page based on it. So we just did that for the remainder of that season, and then wanted to put some more content into theirs, because just that table wasn't enough to get that much interest. So we just gradually started building up the different stats and whatever, and finding sources for stats, and all we had to do was just distill out the big six from all the lists, do a few sums ourselves, and it's gradually grown to what you see today, which is lots of different stats every week, both for the individual week and then for the season to date. And yeah, we gradually built up the following. We're over 42,000 people following now, so it seems to be reasonably popular, and we'll keep doing it as long as it makes sense, I guess. So.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Although I'm sure you still do get, a few dozen every week fans from outside this other 14 that come in and say, where's this player? And you have to just remind them, no, your player is not on this list because you are too big to be on this particular sheet.
We do. And every so often, a couple of years ago, Leicester City fans were saying maybe we should be in the other 14. They're not saying that now. This season, some Newcastle fans are saying that, and maybe that situation will change. But yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. It is mostly aimed at the teams who are somewhere near the bottom. It's the most interesting for them, and including all of the 14 helps the context for those guys as much as anything. So yeah, so we'll probably keep it at the 14 as long as that makes some sort of sense. When it seems like nonsense, then we'll have to change it in some way, but we'll work that out when it comes along.
Yeah, if it does become the other 13, I'm sure that'll make the baseline tracker a bit more difficult to work out, but we'll cross that hurdle when we get to it, I'm sure.
Yes.
To bring everyone else up to speed on this as well, the information that the other 14 use typically tends to be from FBref, which is a fantastic online resource that have for plenty of more in-depth stats than even what you'll find on the other 14's Twitter account, along with Who Scored, which also do have some interesting ones on there as well. And I would encourage all of you that are interested to look out there on the internet, because there are a number of free resources out there that are very useful for bringing together the stats. You've just got to be careful as to pretty much every different website has a different XG value, so that one does tend to become an issue if you don't stick to one area. What we're looking to do today, though, is just basically pick out from both of us, or at least hopefully there won't be too much overlap, in terms of an interesting stat or stat we find interesting about each team as a whole, and one stat and a stat on a player, or possibly a couple of honourable mentions as well about each about a player, or maybe 2 or 3 from each team as well. And we'll go one by one, and just try to give you guys out there some sort of insight as to some of the things that you might have missed, or just some things that we feel as though are worth pointing out about each team and or player. So we're going to go alphabetical order, which does, if you go AFC Bournemouth, does start with Bournemouth, although I'm not sure this may be the only time we come first in anything this season by the looks of things. Certainly, if as the host, I'll just put up a few that really just make things more and more worrying for me as a Bournemouth fan as the season goes on, given we've had the fewest shots of any team, the lowest XG, the highest expected goals against, the most shots against, the least possession. Things just aren't looking great in terms of Bournemouth's statistics. Anything outside of those that you've noticed? Anything positive that you may have noticed, Alan, for Bournemouth?
Well, I guess when we talked about the baseline tracker table, Bournemouth are not in the bottom 3 currently.
That's a good point.
In the baseline tracker table, so that reflects the fact that potentially the fixtures in the run-in are potentially slightly easier than some of the teams around. So that doesn't predict the future, though. That doesn't say they still will get out of the bottom 3 at the end, but it does say they've got a slightly less of an uphill task to pick up some points towards the end of the season here. So that's the one positive on the team stats side of things for Bournemouth, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And 538 and Optra and a few others, their predictions for final position predictors give Bournemouth about a 50-50 chance on relegation at the moment, along with a few others. So yeah, it's not all doom and gloom yet, but it's easy to find it. As for players that have stood out, I mean, as this is a Bournemouth channel, most fans that will be looking at this will sort of have their own opinions on certain players. But I would say Tavernier has been one of the most important players for Bournemouth all season. It was a period where he was, I can't remember who I got this phrase from. It was someone on Tifos. He was the dribbliest boy in the Premier League for a decent while. That dropped off because he was injured, but he still has 33 successful dribbles, which is very high on ratings, and there's a 45.8% success rate, so it's fantastic in that regard, along with his goals and assist tally. But Neto is one that I think statistically jumps out as well. He is slightly overshadowed in the numbers for most departments by Leno, who we may well come on to for Fulham, but he still has the second most shots saved from inside the penalty area. It's the second best post-shot expected goals of 3.3 in terms of the other 14. But he does have the highest save percentage. He does beat Leno in save percentage at 77.6, just barely beats him out. But Neto has been a very important player for us since coming in to replace Travers. Alan, what players have started to you for Bournemouth?
Well, I'd agree with you on Neto. My pick was Marcus Senesi, partly because I've got Tavernier in there as an honourable mention because he clearly, as you were saying, was started very strongly and had the injury and fallen away slightly because of that. But I picked Senesi really in the category of a player that does pretty well on all the defensive stats, in particular with blocks and clearances, that sort of thing. Doesn't get mentioned that much. And I think that's going to be a common theme with a lot of mine, is they're not necessarily the statistically best player, because the statistically best player in most of these teams gets talked about. So I picked him as somebody that is talked about a bit less, but yet seems to be there or thereabouts with a lot of the stats that you'd be interested in measuring for him in the position that he plays. So he's the guy I've gone for there. I've also, as an honourable mention, mentioned Ouattara. Is that how you say it?
Ouattara, yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, he's not been around long enough to have made many of the tables at this point. But in the individual game stats since he arrived, he's been making some significant work. So he's noticeable in that. So hopefully, if he can keep that up for the rest of the season, that's going to be a good contribution for Bournemouth.
Yeah, absolutely. He's certainly one of the ones to watch in terms of Premier League's under-21 players as well. After only being in for a couple of months, he's definitely made an impression on fans of Bournemouth and also those that have watched him as well. I would say. Moving on to Aston Villa. Got to be honest. Aston Villa was one of the most difficult ones to find a team stat for that I felt interesting to talk about, because they've been very middle of the pack. They are essentially middle of the road at this point, being 10th or 11th. I think 10th above Chelsea now, possibly. But yeah, one thing I did sort of notice was their errors leading to goals stat when I was trawling through FBref trying to find something interesting for them. They are not the highest. That is a difference. That is Everton. Everton have conceded the most, have had the most errors leading to goals in 14, but Aston Villa are joint second in the other 14 with 11. And one of the reasons I picked that out is because Aston Villa have an ex-Cherry player in Tyrone Mings, who is one of our highest ever selling, one of our biggest ever sales to another club, who is statistically still doing pretty well, and he's got most clearances, most tackles, most progressive yards carried, and of all players that have had 10 appearances for Aston Villa, he's got the most points per match in 1.58. But he is known for making mistakes, and he has made a couple of errors leading to goals. But Aston Villa, I think something that I'm sure Emery has done well to sort of stamp out quite well is their defensive record, and certainly errors leading to goals is higher than I'd imagine they'd want it to be. But it's an interesting one that I'm sure any Villa fans watching are probably able to back up, that they have made a few too many mistakes at the back this season.
Yeah, Mings is in a similar category to the player I've chosen in terms of having improved quite significantly in a lot of his stats since Emery came in. The one I chose was Ollie Watkins, and it's difficult to know the reason, but in things like his shot accuracy has improved drastically. Either whether you want to say since the World Cup, whether you want to say since Emery came in, or whether you want to say since Danny Ings left. You know, one of those things has caused Ollie Watkins' goal and assist rate and shot accuracy, and most of these sort of stats that will be relevant to a centre forward have all had a jump up in class, as it were. So it's just interesting to consider whether that's because he's now the main man because Ings has gone, or if Emery's doing something with him, or or whatever else has changed. But that was a noticeable thing for me, that sort of step up.
He is a player that I think a lot of is sort of being touted for England because of his improvement. I would say he has been very, very impressive since the return from the World Cup.
Yeah. My honourable mention for Villa is Boubacar Kamara, although he's now injured at the moment, and I think that's a bit of a blow for Villa. But as a guy in the midfield who none of his stats are sort of startling or right at the top, but he's sort of there or thereabouts top 10 for most of the relevant metrics that you'd be interested in. So and again, somebody that people don't talk about too much. So that's the reason I've given him a bit of a mention.
Lovely. What was your team stat for Aston Villa?
Well, again, as you said, it's sort of they're very sort of middle of the road and not dramatically bad, but not dramatically great for anything there. I mean, it's interesting how the baseline tracker is reflecting the Premier League in the sense that there's an upper half and a lower half. Yeah. And as we know, as keeps being talked about in the media, is anybody from the bottom 9 is potentially a candidate for going down, and then the other 11 are, if you like. And they've Aston Villa have got themselves comfortably above that sort of gulf between 11th and 12th, as it were. So, but yes, they've done that reasonably quietly and with no particular, apart from the fact that most of the metrics have improved since Emery came in. So doing a good job there.
Yeah, that's probably the one to take away most from. It's Emery is better than Gerrard. There's your baseline stat for Aston Villa. Brentford, Alan, why don't I let you go first in terms of Brentford? What stood out to you, team player wise, for Brentford?
Yeah, so I've gone for Matthias Jensen, and again, I've a bit of a theme here. I'm sort of picking players that that people wouldn't necessarily go to first. And there's a few obvious places you'd go if you were looking at Brentford. Obviously, they've got the top scorer of the other 14 plays for Brentford. But yeah, I've gone for Jensen just in terms of, again, sort of high. It's sometimes top 5, between 5 and 10 for all the sort of significant metrics, and a big chance creator for them, albeit mostly from set pieces, but all the chances you create do count. But yeah, so I've gone for him. Also, and he's actually on the other 14 top assisters, if you like, table as well. So both his XA and his chances created are translating into actual assists. So things like long passes, various of that. He's not the top of anything, but he's somewhere near the top of most of those things. And then honourable mentions, I've got De Silva, who has the highest dribble success rate in the other 14, and Brian Mbermo, who represents a significant improvement in various things since last season, if you like. So Brian Mbermo last season was one of these people whose XG was dramatically outperforming his goals scored. Not say that the nice way round, but this year that's changed, and he's keeping that up, and he's and various other metrics, chance creation as well as goal scoring and so on, have all done well there. So those are the mentions I have for Brentford.
Lovely. In terms of Brentford, for me, yeah, Ivan Toney was sort of like the one that I don't think anyone needs shining on any more light upon. He's just been so very impressive this season, and quite rightly got his England call up again for the current set of internationals. A player that I haven't really thought about much is actually David Raya, the goalkeeper, and I think, as though I'm sure the goalkeepers will get their shine in this session, I think it's easy to focus on the outfield players. Raya, quite interestingly, trawling through his stats, shows that of all goalkeepers in the other 14, he has the highest percentage completion for long passes at 46.8%. Which may well be shining more on Toney again, because winning those passes is reliant on the ability of your striker as well, I suppose. So it does shine a bit slightly on him. And the other thing that's from the tables that you publish was in terms of the saves that goalkeepers are making, just how many. Well, Raya is at the top in terms of number of saves, but whilst Leno's are more impressive in terms of saves from inside the penalty area and inside the 6-yard box, Raya's made 49 saves from shots from outside the penalty area, and I don't think any other goalkeeper is above 25 at the moment. So that's sort of the thing on both Raya and on the team. Obviously, Raya is more expected to make those saves, but the team of Brentford seem to be so good, and I do think Ben Mee, as a player that's come in this season with his experience, will have helped with that. Obviously, Brentford typically play with a back three as well, but they obviously are very good at forcing opposition to take long shots, and not allowing really the opportunities to really develop inside their own penalty area, which is just another reason as to why Brentford are doing so incredibly well this season. It was that number, like double basically every other keeper, just in terms of, was really quite something that stood out to me straight away. On that one.
It's intriguing as well that although I've not analysed why this is or tried to look at what's actually going on there, but Raya is also in the top 10 for progressive yards carried, all players.
Of all players?
Yeah, so all players in the other 14. So he's carrying it progressively, or dribbling forward, or whatever you want to call that, more than most outfield players of the other 14. And really wants to sort of spend some time looking at Brentford matches to see what's going on there, whether he's actually bringing the ball out without being pressed or what's happening there. But I found that interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, you definitely need to find out what's going on there. You'd find it hard to believe that it was because Brentford are forcing their opposition into their own half, and Raya's got 20 yards to put the ball up the pitch before he has to kick it or something like that. That is very odd. Interesting. Okay, so next on the list, 3 down, 11 to go, is Brighton and Hove Albion, who are arguably the story of the season, if not for a couple of others that are also having particularly outrageous seasons. But certainly, sort of in terms of surface level stats, they have the most possession. They have carry the most possession of any team in the other 14 at 59.4%, which is 8.4% higher than the next best in Newcastle. So it's not even close. Their style is so ball dominant in comparison to. Well, it'd be interesting to see where they are in just the full 20 as well, because I'd imagine they rate very, very highly, even with the other big teams in
they
there.
are third or fourth, I think, from memory.
Yes, it's
behind the
really
obvious
high.
candidates.
And the other thing would be to say is that in terms of they have the fewest shots against in 236 in the table of the other 14. They don't have the lowest XG against. That is Newcastle, but they face the fewest shots. So there again, another reason as to why they really are quite as high as they are. To flip things slightly, because I'm not going to be pulling positives on every single stat for every single team. Danny Welbeck is currently showing as essentially the worst striker in terms of goal scoring in the other 14 as things currently stand. His non-penalty post-shot is non-penalty goals to expected goals. He's on minus 3.4, which is a decent chunk below almost every other player in the other 14. It's he does a hell of a lot more than score goals for Brighton, but as a striker. And purely as a goal scorer, he is showing rather poorly this season, unfortunately. But I'd still think he's having something of an what is the phrase Indian summer at Brighton, having really getting those minutes that he wasn't getting when he had all those injuries at Man United and Arsenal. How about yourself, Arnold? What stood out for Brighton?
Well, I guess similar in terms of the team. So yes, numbers of passes and that sort of thing, which is, I guess that's a similar stat or the result of the same behaviour as the possession stats and so on. Yeah, that's, I mean, and as what they do is obviously as a team. So a lot of what's going on, it's difficult to pick out individual players because what they're doing as a team is what most of the story here. The player I've picked out to talk about in more detail is Pascal Gross. Again, partly because a bit of an unsung hero, I think, probably there.
Yeah.
And has been the leading chance creator and in the top 2 or 3 chance creators of the other 14 ever since he started at Brighton. So that's ever since Brighton got promoted, in fact. So it didn't matter what manager it is. It's the same under Houghton, under Potter, and now under De Zerbi. He is the one that creates lots and lots of chances. And that's something which probably goes a little bit under the radar, and particularly this year with Solly March has gone from being quite a good squad player to being completely outstanding. Karu Matoma has come in after his World Cup and is setting everywhere on fire. So they're getting noticed, but Pascal Gross for me is the one who is just steadily outperforms everybody, particularly as I say in chances created. Used to be quite set piece heavy a few years ago, but it's quite there's lots of non-set piece chances created as well for him now, and that's being reflected in assists now that the rest of the Brighton team can shoot a bit better than they were a couple of seasons ago. So Pascal Gross is the guy I've chosen, and I've already mentioned the other people that I guess the other one I haven't mentioned so far would be Lewis Dunk, but he gets talked about a fair amount anyway. But certainly in terms of progression, both in terms of progressive yards passing and progressive carrying, and just being the sort of quarterback distributor for the team, he's had a very good season from that point of view as well.
Yeah, that was a stat that I saw as well in Lewis Dunk. His sheer volume of long passes. There are only 2 players in the other 14 that attempt more long passes than their goalkeeper, because obviously you would expect the goalkeepers to produce all the long passes and hit it long. Lewis Dunk was one of them, considerably outdoing Robert Sanchez in long passes, and I don't think it would surprise many that the other one that does more kicking than his goalkeeper is Kieran Trippier, who also does a hell of a lot of, is basically as key as any other player to a particular team's progression. Yes. But we'll get on to Newcastle later on. So that was Brighton. Moving on next, Crystal Palace, another team that's rather, give it a couple months ago, they were also quite middle of the road as well, but things have significantly gone downhill for them recently. Speaking of which, most points lost from I say speaking of which, they actually have the most points gained from losing positions this season, which is the interesting thing, considering they've been just going on losing streaks recently. But they have from the 19 times they've
most of that was in the first half of the season.
Yeah, that's very true. For the 19 times they've gone behind the season, they've got 14 points back from it, which is pretty darn impressive in that stat, certainly. But yes, it has changed somewhat for them recently. But in terms of players, I think the one that sort of showed up to me because of how high he was on the table in terms of dribble success rate was Eberechi Eze, who is 54.5% dribble success rate, second highest of those that qualify for the table in the other 14, which actually puts him a few behind Zaha in terms of successful dribbles. Zaha has 45 as opposed to Eze's 42, but he is far more efficient with it. Eze, and it's players like Eze and Elise that are going to be the ones to get Palace safe. You would feel real quality they brought from the Championship last season. They just haven't quite kicked on yet so far. But how about yourself, Alan?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Again, Crystal Palace are at the top of the of that 9 who are in relegation contention on the baseline tracker table, and didn't really, a big losing streak, but they were mostly non-baseline games, as we would call them on that table. So they're not games that, I'm not saying that you wouldn't expect them to win, but they're not games that are bankers for the 3 points, as it were. Yeah. So it's partly fixture list related that they've had such a bad run. They've now gone to sack their manager on the basis of that, so we'll see what happens. But yeah, obviously Steve Parish doesn't look at my tables, but yeah, the player I've gone for is as my pick is Cheick Doucouré, who has been quietly getting on with a really good job in the middle of the park for Crystal Palace. Pretty high up on on things like tackles and interceptions, tackles and interceptions per 90, tackle success rates. So the sort of guy in the middle of the park that's winning the ball back for you. And again, that sort of job doesn't tend to get the glamour and get talked about that much, but he's been doing that pretty well. And no teammates anywhere near him, so he's sort of been doing it single-handed, if you like. And I think that's right. It's interesting doing what we do and with the Twitter page, is the reactions that we get from the fans of the different teams, and it is pretty well recognised by Palace fans as well that he's doing a sort of solo role in there in terms of the ball winning in the middle of the park. So he was my pick. Joachim Andersen is also interesting in a dramatic improvement this year relative to previous years in his heading duels, winning and per 90 and so on. His long passing is always interesting. So if you just count the number of long passes, then he's always pretty high up. But that's because he attempts an awful lot of long passes. So a lot of them are inaccurate. So if you're looking at long pass accuracy, then he doesn't show that well. But he has a lot of, every week he tends to appear on, we do a table of just for the week of how many long passes, and he's always pretty high on that. But his dramatic improvement has been in his aerial ability. So kind of interesting. We also had Eze, but you've mentioned him as well as an honourable mention, as it were.
Yes, Eze doing very well in as we mentioned before in terms of his dribbling. Everton. I've just realised I've gone quite negative on Everton in terms of the stats that I've picked out here, but it has been an odd Yeah, it's been another odd season, but one that's it's turning around for them, no doubt, under Daesh. Um,
Mm.
in terms of the stats I've picked out, as you may have noticed, those that haven't watched one of my videos before, I am quite a big fan of XG, and I have noticed certainly for Everton they have the out of the other 14 only slightly ahead of West Ham, and I think Wolves was the other one that's right down there. They have the worst difference between goals scored and expected goals, non-penalty anyway, in that regard. I do try and stick with non-penalty stats on these, of -10. So they should have scored 10 more goals than they actually have in regards to their attacking. And one of the reasons for this may well be because of Neil Maupay, who's a player that I do feel gets a lot of stick. Quite rightly so in terms of his goal scoring for that regard. There's no doubt that he's a hard worker, but for strikers, he has this tag that he is just not a goal scorer. He just won't score many goals, and he is on -2.8 in his goals versus expected, and it's losing the likes of Dominic Calvert-Lewin and not having too many others really to fit that to sort of go in that place. That's why that's another reason why they're struggling. It's thankfully they're defended so well and have some players the likes of Pickford and others that are keeping the ball out the other end. Otherwise, they may well have been in much deeper a pickle.
I think Maupay's an interesting one because he was interesting at Brighton as well for a similar. Not you can't pick this what I'm about to say out of the stats that easily, but he always seems to be the goal scorer who can score the worldies but misses the easier ones, which is, that's just an attribute that some strikers have, I guess. But so the more easier ones he has, the less well he does. So you almost need him to hover around the edge of the box in worldy country, and he'd do a lot better. But anyway,
maybe
we picked out as the key guy or the really strong guy who is a bit Marmite, as it were, in terms of people either love him or hate him, in Everton as well, is Alex Iwobi. So Alex Iwobi's, if you go through all of our tables, and even certainly in the attacking ones, things like chances created, I mean, he leads the other 14 in non-set piece chances created by quite a distance as well. But also things like dribbling, and he even crops up in things like tackling and intercepting and whatever. He's pretty high up there. I made a little note of the tables that he features on, and he's one of the players that's got the most little notes on it on my pad here, just because he does a pretty good job in a lot of things and a really good job in some. But as you were just saying, creating a lot of chances at Everton doesn't necessarily get you a lot of assists because they're not putting them away at the moment. He does feature on the assist table as well, though, so he's getting enough of them to feature on the assist table. Iwobi definitely the guy for me. But as I say, from reactions of Everton fans, they either love him or they hate him, and there's it's really there's two factions there. That's always interesting to observe in terms of the reactions that we get to things. But yeah, definitely the guy for me. The other one I've got, as I mentioned, is Tarkowski. Just really reliable defensive stats for a centre back, and the number of blocks he had, he's got like 50 more blocks than second place in terms of being the leading blocker of the other 14, and therefore probably of the whole league, I would imagine. So yes, and very high on heading duels won. Just all the stats you'd expect for a centre back, he's well up there. So just does a really good job in that. Not so great on the going forward and the progressive stuff and distribution and whatever. He's there or thereabouts, but as a solid defender. And he must be loving Sean Dyche going in there. Yeah. They will understand each other very well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was thinking. Perfect Sean Dyche player. So it's a good thing that Dyche has come in for him. And I imagine McNeil's probably thinking something similar. So moving on to our next team is Fulham, one of the other stories of the season, no doubt. It's an interesting one. I haven't looked at the exact stats on it, but I remember. I can't remember which set of stats because obviously which XG ones, because obviously different you do get them slightly different depending on the people that collect the data. But I know that they had the lowest, sorry, not lowest, they had the highest expected goals against of any team in the division, according to, I can't remember whether it was Opta or whether it was whether it was the other one. But they're just managing to just prevent those goals despite conceding chances. You know, they are outdoing the non-penalty expected goals they should be conceding by 9.3. So they're just really doing a very, very good job at even though they give up chances, not conceding. And I'm sure we'll come on to one of the reasons for that shortly as one of your picks for player to look out for. As for, in terms of their attackers, I think that Mitrovic is a player that that anyone that watched him in the Championship would have told you he will tear things up this year. And I don't think that anyone that saw him play for Fulham last year under Silva is surprised. Well, maybe a little bit surprised at how well he's doing, but he has been so important to them and also so effective as long as he's not pushing referees. But his aerial dominance is surprising. He's right at the top in terms of aerial duels 1 per 90 at 4.6 is quite something. Kiefer Moore just behind him, of course, for Bournemouth, even though he doesn't play all that much at the moment. And the other fascinating one is Solomon that has just come in. Obviously, he's outperforming his XG by 3 goals. He scored 4 from 1 XG, 2 of which were identical. So it's quite something to see a player come in and have such an instant impact. Like that. But yeah, offensively and defensively, they're just doing such a good job this season. But they are outdoing their stats somewhat, so it might be interesting to see what their second season syndrome looks like.
Absolutely, yeah. And you know, as you alluded to, the player we've gone for is Bernd Leno, and a big chunk of the what you were saying about their XG against relative to their goals is because of Leno's PSXG difference. So yeah, he leads the other 14 in terms of that, again by a bit of a distance. And as we mentioned earlier on as well, has made the most saves of shots inside the 6-yard box. And you know, they love him at Fulham as well. You know, it's very well recognised there that he's making a big difference for them. So you know, so that's key. But a couple of honourable mentions we've got, and one of them I guess is pretty obvious in João Palhinha, in that. Yeah, everybody's noticed that he's pretty good on most dimensions. Again, running the middle of the park, tackles, interceptions, winning heading duels in the middle of the park as well. The other one I've got though is Kenny Teti, just for a couple of different things. First of all, he leads on tackle success percentage for the other 14. Oh. And he's also on the assist table. So sort of going in both directions, he's pretty useful for them there on the right flank. So worth a mention as well there.
Yeah, that's interesting. The highest tackle percentage. That's pretty impressive then, particularly for a right back. Leeds, moving on to yeah, Leeds was an interesting one when I was looking around long balls, and in terms of the Leeds just don't do that compared to the rest. They have attempted the fewest long passes of any team in the other 14. And looking at the Opta's the analyst site, they have them as the most direct team in the division, above all, as they are the fastest upfield, which seems odd if you're only going for short passes, if you don't attempt any long passes, and yet they're still going faster than every team up the pitch. That's almost oxymoronic in terms of its combination. So it just shows how sort of manic Leeds can be as a team. Although I mentioned that's changed slightly under the new.
Well, I guess because when they first came up under Bielsa, there were quite a few long balls, quite a few long passes. So that's something that changed under Jesse Marsh, and yeah, we'll see what happens to it now, obviously. But yeah, no, I hadn't seen that most direct stat as well. So that's an interesting one to try and observe exactly what's going on there.
Yeah, exactly. How about yourself, Alan?
So with players, I've gone the player to look at most closely. I've got is Brendan Aronson. Again, a player that you either love him or you hate him if you live in Leeds. You've seen there are people that think he's completely hopeless, and there are others that defend him to the hilt. But again, as a player going forward, I've got things that you can't measure so well in stats, lots of energy, that sort of thing. But yeah, but does show in things like chances created, dribbles, touches in the attacking third, those sorts of things. He's pretty high up there, and a player that you could have mentioned would be Jack Harrison, but Harrison and Aronson are sort of neck and neck in a lot of these things. And Harrison, I think everybody knows that. Aronson, I think, is probably less well recognised for it, so that's why I went for him to talk about. The honourable mention for me would be Rodrigo. Probably a shame for Leeds that he's been injured part of the season, because in terms of goal scoring, conversion rates, that sort of thing, he ranks very highly. And if he'd have been playing all season, then they probably would have a few more goals on the board than they do.
Yeah, I had Harrison down as well, in terms of just how influential he must be further up the pitch for Leeds. There's, in terms of your table for most touches in opposition third, there's a chunk of first, second, third, and fourth for I think it's Newcastle and Leicester players in that area. I think it's Leicester, but underneath that chunk, in fifth place, Brighton. That was it, not Brighton. A different blue team. Is Harrison in fifth with 578 touches, which it shows his influence further up the pitch for Leeds, and definitely. It's just a name that always seems to be so important for how Leeds create further up the pitch. So yeah, it's one that has been linked to. Well, I mean, obviously, Man City product. I'm certain he's been linked to other bigger teams in the division, no doubt. Wouldn't be surprised to see him get a big move within the next few years, particularly if Leeds go down, obviously. But we'll see whether that happens or not. Moving on to Leicester. And Leicester, the good thing for Bournemouth, one of the things that I think Bournemouth fans may well have thought I'd bring up is the amount of points we've lost from winning positions. And we may well set a record this season. I don't know whether we will. It'd be interesting to look back as to the most points dropped from being 2 goals in front so far this season, given we've lost 9 points from those situations. But in terms of pure value, Leicester have dropped the most points from winning positions this season. 19 points dropped from the 14 times they've been in front this season. So, so thankfully Bournemouth don't top that table, and Leicester do. But it's just another one of the reasons why they've struggled this season. Certainly, I've spoken to a Leicester fan on a video recently, and yeah, he's really struggling with his staying positive at all this season. In terms of players, I do think the one that stood out to me the most by far was Ian Acho's creativeness. Him, and to be fair, Maddison is right behind him, but he has the highest expected assists per 90 of those in the other 14, 0.37. Madison's just behind him at 0.34. But to have a striker as your most creative, as the most creative outlet, essentially, or most efficiently creative output in the league, in the other 14, is quite an interesting one to come up with, and you wonder how they're continually struggling. It seems that's the problem. If the striker's the one putting it across to someone else, you don't have that person to put it in the back of the net. So they need to do a better job of feeding Ian Acho rather than him feeding everyone else. Yeah,
and he's not played that much either. His minutes are reasonably low. Which, I mean, maybe you say he should be playing more based on some of the stats that he's posting. But I guess maybe the more you play, maybe being consistently posting those sorts of numbers gets harder when you play more. So, who knows whether he would do that. Yeah, Leicester have been they started the season being very uncharacteristically poor in most dimensions early on. They picked up a little bit, but they're still very inconsistent, I think. So, from one week to the next, their possession can be really good or really awful, and so difficult to know what they can't seem to string a few games together where they all play well at this point. So it's going to be interesting to see whether what happens now the rest of the season for them. In terms of the player, we picked out Kiernan Dewsbury Hall, and again, I mean, the obvious pick is somebody like Maddison. Obviously, probably one of the best players that they've got there, but everybody talks about him. So, wanted to just call out Dewsbury Hall, partly because again, does most things reasonably well, certainly on the defensive side of being in midfield, but also shows really strongly on chances created. Doesn't take set pieces at all, so all of his chances created are non-set piece open play chances created. Also looks reasonably high on the dribble success. So yeah, and above Maddison on some of those things. So and probably doesn't get that much attention or notice that's what's going on there. So that's why we've gone for him. Similarly, Timothy Castagna we've got as an honourable mention. Again, does his job as a fullback pretty high. If you just sort of measure it among fullbacks, he's there or thereabouts in most of the metrics that you'd be interested. Again, I think probably goes under the radar and doesn't get noticed that much. And just as somebody that's come in recently since the January window, Harry Sutar, been doing a really good job. Again, hitting duels, that sort of thing. He's not appearing on the tables yet because he's not played enough yet, but showing signs that week by week that he's posting numbers. So those are the ones we wanted to bring out.
Yeah, Harry Suter was someone that really stood out for Stoke last year. I was not surprised at all that he got a move. Maybe a little bit surprised it didn't happen at the start of the season. Although it wasn't too long before he got injured, and obviously had a really good World Cup. So, yeah, pleased to see him do well because I do like him. Moving on to Newcastle, a team that may well not be in your calculations for very much longer if they keep things up as they are. I believe I mentioned this before. They have the lowest expected goals against in the other 14, 24.9. And are pretty good at making sure they don't give up too many high quality chances as well. But in terms of players, looking again at an ex-Cherry and Callum Wilson, is doing pretty darn well in terms of the charts. He has 10 goals and assists this season, which is not too bad really, considering he features relatively highly on the total table for goals and assists, but has been a little bit out of form. He is underperforming somewhat in terms of his goals. He's at minus 1.7 compared to his expected goals. So I don't think it's a surprise that he's been dropped for Isak, who, at the moment is showing as the most efficient striker on your table in terms of 6 goals from not all that much XG. But there is only one person to talk about if we're going to talk about an overperforming attacker, and that is War Miggy Almiron, who's at plus 4.9 on is overperforming by 5 goals essentially, which is quite incredible. It does lead to belief that there will be a significant drop off at some point. But he did grab a goal recently after a bit of a drought. But just one of the main reasons Newcastle are doing so well has been Almiron this season. There's no doubt about that.
And the other, I mean, in most cases I've gone for players that nobody else notices or tried to, but with Newcastle, I've gone for Kieran Trippier, even though everybody knows how good he's been. But it's difficult not to. And I think you mentioned earlier on that it's bordering on dependency in terms of how Newcastle need Trippier and what he's doing. If you look at our chances created table, he's at the top by a distance. And until Joe Willock just sneaked into the table in recent weeks, he was the only one there. So they're not spreading those chances around the team very much. They're all coming from him. A lot of them are set pieces because he's taking all the corners and all the free kicks anywhere near the opposition box, but he's doing that effectively and taking chances from them. So his defensive stats are sort of fair to middling. They're not that great, but everything sort of in the going forward attributes of a fullback. Even to the extent of being, I think it was either second or third in touches in the attacking third
second
of any
yeah.
player, not just defenders or not just fullbacks, but any player. So he's a fullback that spends all his time in the attacking third. That probably reflects what Newcastle are doing and whatever. You mentioned their XG allowed as being so low, and people have been saying that's because they have the best defence, is the sort of glib phrase that people are using to describe that. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. I don't think it's the defenders that are doing that. I think it's the whole team.
Yeah.
Which is when the opposition get the ball, the whole team swarm. And so the defenders actually have a relatively easy life. There's not much even reaches them, let alone getting in Nick Pope. So it's defensively as an 11, they're extremely effective. This is probably the way I put it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one thing we learned in the last month and a half, it's don't force Nick Pope to play with the ball at his feet. You don't necessarily want that. Although Nick Pope does have very good sweeper keeper stats, but not so much under pressure, it seems. Moving on, Nottingham Forest. Now, this was one of the few stats that Forest are actually, where Bournemouth are not the worst, was Forest do have the fewest number of touches in the opposition penalty area at 412, which isn't that much less than Bournemouth, but it is lower. So I can at least sort of hang my hat on not being overly negative that Bournemouth are bottom of every important attacking stat. But in terms of players, I think Gibbs White is the one that stands out to me the most in terms of. I absolutely love Gibbs White. I think he's an incredible player. I think the unbelievable reaction, well, I say somewhat believable reaction, that basically it was like he could cost 40 million from Wolves if all these add-ons are met. But if you watched him in the Championship, you would have known that he was a step above, and he's showing that in the Prem. However, in terms of players that are sort of, I'm going to take something from take your hat from you in terms of looking at a lesser focused on player, is I think Nico Williams. I think is a player that is funny, because speaking to a Fulham fan at the start of the season, they weren't that fussed that they didn't get Williams full time. They saw him as a capable deputy in the Championship, but weren't all that worried about that they weren't going to keep him. But for Forest, I mean, he's third in their team for shot creating actions. He has the second highest tackle and interceptions value per 90 of the other 14, with De Core, I believe, is top of that one of the per 90 stats on 5.35. And it's just offensively and defensively, he is just very reliable and very good at what he does. I think as much as they do have three players in every position, essentially, with all the buys they've had, he's a player that I think they've missed when he's been injured. Been quietly impressed with the work that Nico Williams has been doing when he's played for Forest.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue with that. I mean, I've gone for Gibbs White being the more taking the sort of being more obvious approach this time. But because he outstandingly appears near the top of the various attacking stats, and often he's the only Forest player on tables for the various attacking stats. So it becomes very difficult to overlook him from that point of view. So sort of dribbles, chances created with and not including he does take some set pieces, but most of his chances created are open play. So we've got him there. Also got to mention Brennan Johnson, who interestingly has very high shot accuracy. I think that's second in our table for shot accuracy, if I remember correctly. I'm not looking at it directly at the moment, but and then the other player that I thought was interesting to note, because he pops up when I'm compiling these things quite frequently, is Serge Aurier. So Serge Aurier has, interestingly, he's the alternative for Nico Williams in the same position. Yeah. But yeah, he also has some pretty good stats across the board, and pops up on the heading duels table, which is an interesting thing for a fullback to do. But I guess sometimes he's been playing, when they've had a back three, he's been playing right centre back a little bit as well. So maybe that's part of the reason for that. But yeah, Serge Aurier, tackles, interceptions, tackle percentage, heading duels, looking pretty high up, which wasn't something I would have expected if you'd have asked me at the beginning of the season that would happen. So.
Yeah, I think it's whilst Williams has been injured, I think already it does seem like he has taken Williams' spot on that right wing back slot / right back. But moving on to Southampton. So the team stat that I pulled out from Southampton is that they have been behind in more games than any other team so far this season, which I suppose is not really all that surprising considering they are bottom of the table. But they have got 12 points from those positions, which is a decent chunk more than a lot of other teams have got from losing positions. And I mean, you've only got to look at some of their recent results in terms of that comeback against Spurs. There's definitely seems to be a real growing belief that they can escape relegation, even if I think they are probably favourites to go down as things currently stand. To flip on the negativity again for Southampton is a player that I expected a lot more from this season because of all the hype surrounding him, and particularly as a very from the sounds of things had a really good season at Portsmouth last year. Is Gavin Bazunu, who is quite comfortably at the bottom in terms of the worst performing goalkeepers this season at -12 post shot expected goals according to -12.1 according to FB Ref. I mean, the closest one to that I think is Mark Travers, another Irish goalkeeper who's on about 6 and a bit, who we dropped and got Neto in and swung that by nine goals. But yeah, I don't know. I just heard I've heard a lot of good things about him. I heard the hype coming from Man City. It's just not quite worked for him this season, unfortunately. But yeah, well, I mean, it's an interesting one. I don't know. I think that maybe some Southampton fans that are turning and saying why they're not trying McCarthy or someone else instead a bit more often, because I'm not sure what's going wrong there. But yes, that was the player that stood out to me the most. Unfortunately, not for a good reason.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've gone for Sulemana as a player to pick out, and he's not been there very long yet, so he doesn't appear on many tables yet, just by not having made the qualifying number of whatever it is. Although he does already appear on the dribble success table, fairly high up.
Wow.
And so but he's obviously making a difference there since he's arrived. So and doing in an attacking sense is making a difference for them. I couldn't ignore James Ward-Prowse as the honourable mention, just because he is the player who is reliably on every table I do, almost, except the goalkeeping one. People think of him as a set piece specialist, and he is very, very good at set pieces. But he does appear on a lot of other things as well. A lot of open play work that he does as well. Strikingly so that he's the only Southampton player on a lot of the tables. So he's almost carrying them from that point of view. So very difficult not to mention him at all. So there, I have.
Yes, and Sulemana was a player that I think that when he was coming in, I think there were a lot of people that had seen him play in France going, yeah, this guy's good. And if he gets going, he could well make the difference. I think he has certainly improved Southampton already. There's no doubt. West Ham. Alan, why don't I let you start with West Ham? Who stood out to you from them?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly worth saying that they don't look great in the league position, but they look even worse on the baseline tracker, and have done for a while. So some of their players in interviews saying they're too good to go down. It's probably a little bit. Well, let's hope they're right, I suppose, if you're a West Ham fan. But,
yeah.
But yeah, so the player I've gone for though to talk about primarily is Said Benrahma. And he again comes in the category of a player that the fans of West Ham either love to love or love to hate, and there doesn't seem to be any middle ground on that. Yeah. He leads the table for us on open play chances created for 90, by actually quite some way. But that's chances created without qualifications for how good the chances are. But it is worth noting that he's on the XA90 table as well, although quite a bit lower down than top. But he is on there, so he's not just doing sideways passes for 30-yard shots. But yeah, and he's up there with dribbles. He's up there with most of the attacking metrics. And he doesn't get that many minutes relatively speaking. And a lot of the argument with that happens across Twitter between West Ham fans is that based on what he does in the minutes he gets, he should be getting more. So definitely I'd say that he's my main mention from that point of view. I guess similar to James Ward-Prowse, the guy that you can't not mention when you talk about West Ham is Declan Rice, because he, like Ward-Prowse, is on all of the tables.
Yeah.
He seems to have this this nickname about not being able to pass forwards or something. All his passes are sideways and backwards. It's the sort of big catchphrase of everybody that talks about him on Twitter. Clearly not the case, because he's up there on progressive passing yards, and he's up there on progressive carries and chances created and whatever. He's on all the tables, both going forwards as well as sideways. But yeah, and had a great game last night too for England. So he's obviously a very good player sitting in a team that's not doing so well this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Scored his third goal for his country. I think it's I think he's top of accurate long pass percentage.
Long pass accuracy, yeah.
Long pass accuracy, yeah. He's because when I was looking, I've got to be honest, I struggled to find something interesting to say about West Ham. They are such they feel such a middle of the road team, and yet they're just so there's nothing that's really going for them at all this season.
Except they might win a European trophy.
That's very true. Yes, that's the biggest trophy they'll ever got. If you talk to most West Ham fans at the moment, I think. But in terms of stats, they're not top of this stat, because I think I pointed out Everton are top of it in terms of their underperforming of expected goals. They're on minus 9.8 as a team, just behind Everton on 10. It's not doing very well for them at all. And you've got to look at players like Jared Bowen that just aren't doing what they did last season. Antonio Scamacca comes in and doesn't really have an impact. Although, to be fair, a player that another ex-Cherry, because obviously I'm going to keep looking out for those. Do you have Danny Ings, who is as far on the tables? Admittedly, he's done it for Villa and West Ham, but he has on your high scorers / high goals and assist table. He scored the most goals without an assist on that table so far. He's got 8 goals, 0 assists.
Sounds like Danny Ings.
Yeah, that is very poaching Danny Ings. Typical 0.63 goals per 90 is pretty darn decent, to be fair. Particularly as that is only goals. That's not goals and assists. That is just goals. But yeah, I've struggled to find something brilliant to talk about with West Ham, because it really does seem to be on a knife edge whether they will quite drop in the same way. It's very, very Everton-like from last season. Just all the players that just don't seem to be up for a relegation battle because they thought they were going to be fighting for Europe. It'd be interesting to see if they do. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, it's worth saying with that Declan Rice stat about the long pass accuracy is that he's topped that table for the last 3 seasons. So it's not a fluke, it's not an anomaly this year. He is very good at long passing.
No doubt. Be interesting to see if they pull a Birmingham or a Wigan. Was it Birmingham? Yes, it was Birmingham and Wigan winning a cup competition and going down in the same season. I hope not. I do quite like West Ham, but to be honest, if anyone goes down instead of Bournemouth, I won't really care too much who it is. And for our final team, Wolverhampton Wanderers, the really interesting one that I saw in my sort of last minute searches for something interesting to say about some streams I was struggling to find something about was their shot quality chance, their quality of shots they are making is quite poor in comparison to basically everyone else. It's a funny one when you look through on FBref and you look at the goalkeeper stats and it shows up this is the quality of chances that the goalkeepers are facing. And basically, every single goalkeeper is in the region of 0.25 to 0.29. Every single goalkeeper is in that range. But then when you look at the flip side of that and you look at, but what are the opposition keepers facing against those teams? And some teams make it quite difficult for their opposition. Some teams make it a lot harder. And Wolves, the teams that they face, the opposition goalkeepers, seem to have a much easier job of keeping goals out. They're only creating 0.2 in terms of post-shot expected goals per shot on target. They are far less likely than every other team to score from a shot on target. It's just weird. it's certainly something to be the strikers don't seem to be able to put it in the corners, I think, in terms of what Wolves strikers are doing at the moment. But they are a team that aren't necessarily scoring all that much, and they're not necessarily conceding all that much. So it does sort of, does sort of even out overall in the end. In terms of players, the one that sort of stood out to me from looking through the tables was Ruben Neves. In terms of just the sheer volume, and combined with volume, his accuracy in terms of his long passing. On the table of successful long passes, his volume, it just stands out head and shoulders above every other side. And when you consider that Wolves are one of the least direct teams in the league, I think they are tied with. In terms of Opta, the analyst put up that they are tied with Chelsea as the third slowest team to progress the ball in the division. And yet you've got Neves that just stands head and shoulders in terms of his long pass accuracy. When you've got someone that is that good on the ball in the middle of the park, it really does help. And with a good manager in Lopetegui coming in, I don't see them struggling at all to avoid the drop from now on.
Yeah, they shouldn't do. They should. I mean, it's strikers are a problem for them. Right? And Raul Jimenez has not been the same since his big injury.
Oh yeah,
and that's probably a big part of it. The player we went for was Podence, and again, a bit of a theme, I guess, is that he's somebody that the Wolves fans either love or hate, and not much in between. But yeah, if you just look at the numbers in terms of chances created, dribbles, shot accuracy as well, leading Wolves at least, and on in the top 20 table for the other 14. So again, one of the players who, he puts up the numbers going forward, and not many players are at Wolves. So stands out from that point of view at the moment. And then the other two honourable mentions I've got for Wolves are the two fullbacks, Aït-Nouri and Semedo, both in terms of carrying and dribbling, and also being pretty useful on their defensive numbers as well. Semedo in particular has turned things around after a fairly poor season last season, and is looking much better on the numbers this season. It's got a bit of a hangover in terms of his reputation with the fans, I think, but looking better than he was from that point of view. So that's my Wolves take.
And that's the other 14. All of them. That was interesting. Yeah, some players that you pulled out there that I certainly hadn't thought about before, and some very interesting stats there from from players. You're right. You picked a theme of peers that people don't think about, or maybe either or a Marmite for their fan bases. And I suppose it's an interesting one. Some of those that maybe don't quite get the credit that maybe they deserve. But then again, that's the interesting thing when looking at stats, is that a lot of people still very much prefer the eye test. And once you've got a particular opinion about a player, it's very difficult to get someone to change their mind, even if you can show them every stat in the world that says they're better than what people might say. But that is the challenge of people like us, to try and convince people otherwise. But yes, that was fascinating. Thank you very much for joining me in this discussion, Aaron, and thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, no, you're very welcome. It's been a very interesting chat, and nice to go. Nice exercise to go through as well, to just sort of pull stuff out of the tables that we do every week, and start to talk about what it really means as well. So yeah, very good.
Brilliant. Well, if you are on Twitter, or even if you're not, and you're an interested fan of a team in the other 14 or Bournemouth fan, I would highly encourage you to follow at other 14 on Twitter. They do put up tables basically every day, certainly around match days. International break, it will slow down a little bit, I'm sure, but yeah, some great resources that prevent you from having to trawl through all of the spreadsheets there are online, and brings you the concise information that you're looking for match days and also for seasons so far as they put them out. But thank you very much for joining myself and Alan on this video. I do hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please do hit that like button and share it around. Let other people know if there's something that you think would be interesting on this, and hey, put in the comments what you think was the most interesting stat that came out of that you didn't know before. But as I said, thank you very much for joining us. And I do hope you'll join us again for another Cherries Red Army video in the future. But until then, thank you very much for watching. Have a lovely day. Up the cherries.